Good afternoon and welcome to the session this afternoon entitled Cutting Edge Issues in TB and HIV. My name is Wafa El Sadr. I'm from ICAP at Columbia University, and I'm very honored to co-moderate this session with my colleague Heidi.
Good afternoon. My name is Haile Jesus Getaon. I work with the Global TB Program of WHO, and I'm happy to co-chair this session. And the first presentation of this session will be done by Soumya Swaminathan, who is head of the National TB Research Institute of India in Chennai. And she was trained as a pediatrician in India, followed by fellowship in pediatric pulmonology at the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. And she will be presenting TB and HIV in my region. Is anyone listening? Soumya.
Good afternoon. And I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. It's only a 15-minute talk, so you'll have to forgive me if I don't cover all the important issues in HIV and TB. I want to start with a little bit of epidemiology. As you all know, globally 13% of TB cases worldwide are HIV co-infected, and a disproportionately large number of deaths. About a quarter of all deaths that occur among TB patients are due to HIV infection. And I think that the global progress in TB is really being affected by the co-infection with HIV in many, many countries. This is a very recent analysis of the years of life lost compared to 1990 and 2013, and we see that TB has gone from the 7th leading cause of death in 1990 to number 11. But HIV, which wasn't even on the screen here, it was down at number 25 or so, has gone up to being the number 6 cause of death in 2013. So what are the main issues with HIV-TB? Well, 1/3 of the global people living with HIV are infected with latent TB, and therefore there's this large pool or reservoir from which active cases can emerge. There's a 30 times higher risk of HIV co-infected people breaking down with tuberculosis compared to HIV uninfected people. And as I said, TB is the most common presenting illness even now in our part of the world, in Africa and in Asia, for people living with HIV to present to healthcare settings, and is also the leading cause of death among people living with HIV, accounting for about 1 in 5 deaths. And these are just the known diagnosed cases of TB. There's probably still a large portion of people who die of HIV-related illnesses who have TB that's diagnosed post-mortem or never. And this is particularly true in children who often die with undiagnosed TB. There are, of course, the emerging threats of MDR and XDR TB as well. Globally, there's been much progress in the percentage of people with a known HIV status, and you can see that the African region has done particularly well. Our part of the world, the Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific regions, still have a ways to go. And this table actually shows, it's a busy slide, but it shows here the percentage of notified TB patients that are tested for HIV. This is data from 2012. You can see it was 74% in Africa, but only about 35 to 40% in our region. In Southeast Asia, about 6% on average of people are co-infected. In the Western Pacific, it's 3%. Of course, the major contributors to TB burden in this part of the world are India, with a quarter of the world's new cases, and China, with about 20%. The proportion of people started on cotrimoxazole is quite high, but if we look at this last column here, the number of people who've had IPT initiated, it's very small. And this shows graphically the same thing. You can see from 2004 to 2012, the proportion of people being tested has increased rapidly, and also the number of HIV-infected people being screened for TB, which is on the right side of this graph. But the IPT is practically invisible. And this is a similar scenario for the Western Pacific region. So again, just showing the example from India of how we've been able to scale up HIV testing among TB patients in the last 4 or 5 years. But what's interesting is when you look at the map of India, the areas colored green are those which have over 70% testing among HIV patients, whereas those that are red are less than 30%. And the one reason for this is that the northern states have a lower HIV prevalence in the community and therefore have fewer testing facilities. So the proportion of people who actually get tested depends a lot on whether the facilities are co-located, the TB testing facilities and the HIV testing facilities, because it makes it very inconvenient for people to travel long distances to get HIV tests done. So what are some of the clinical challenges that we face? The most, I think, critical one is how to diagnose, how to suspect, diagnose early TB amongst HIV-positive people. And then when it comes to treatment, of course, the regimens we use are the same, the standard regimens that we use among HIV-negative people, but then there are issues like drug interactions, particularly with the protease inhibitors and rifampicin, and with immune reconstitution syndrome that often makes it clinically quite challenging to manage some of these patients. MDR-TB, I'll spend a couple of minutes on TB in HIV-positive children, and then finally on how to prevent TB, and then end with service integration. So in terms of diagnosis, we know that sputum smear negative TB, extrapulmonary disseminated TB, these forms are much more common, and you don't come with the classical symptoms of cough and fever necessarily. So you need active case finding, you need the healthcare workers in HIV care settings to be questioning and looking for TB all the time. We did a study in 500 patients who had a cough for more than 2 weeks but negative sputum smears, and we found that cough more than 2 weeks had a very high sensitivity, but you can see the specificity was only about 6%. So it's a good screening tool but not a diagnostic. X-ray also had a specificity of only about 57%, so an abnormality on X-ray doesn't mean it's TB, it needs further investigation. And the converse, a normal X-ray in HIV-infected people with low CD4 counts does not rule out tuberculosis. In the same study, we found 7% of people who had a normal X-ray had a positive sputum culture. So this was published by Haleusis and others a few years ago, showing that the best performing rule as a screening test for people to rule out TB was the presence of any cough, fever, night sweats, and weight loss, which had a very high negative predictive value of about over 98. But of course, we need more sensitive tests than sputum smear microscopy, which is the only thing available to most of us in this region. And it's very encouraging to see the scale up of the cartridge-based nucleic acid amplification test like the GeneXpert, that not only gives a diagnosis of TB within 90 minutes, but also because it targets the RPOB gene, tells us whether there's rifampicin resistance or not. The sensitivity among HIV-infected people has been found to be fairly good. It's a little bit lower than in HIV-uninfected people. The specificity is very high, it's 98% and above, and it's particularly good in extrapulmonary specimens like lymph node aspirates and pus and CSF, not so good in pleural fluid and pericardial fluid. So it's now preferred or recommended as a preferred test by the WHO for smear-negative suspected TB as a first test in HIV-positive persons and in children as a first test. And of course, this depends on the availability and the resources, but this is ideal. And these are a series of forest plots showing the sensitivity and specificity of the expert in HIV-positive individuals with TB symptoms, and we can see that the sensitivity ranges between 60 and 90%, but the specificity is very, very good. So in India, we recently had this pilot implementation study which looked at feasibility and impact of using the expert for diagnosis, particularly in suspected pulmonary TB and in drug-resistant TB. This was done at 18 sites covering a population of 9 million. And if you look at the performance just among these two groups, we find that amongst the HIV-positive, there were about 2,800 patients screened, and 28% were found positive by the CBNAT, whereas 12.9% by smear microscopy. And similarly in children, 10% by GeneXpert and 5% by AFB smear microscopy. So doubled the diagnosis, bacteriological diagnosis of TB. So certainly to be used as a point of care test, particularly if it's present at the ART centers or the HIV care settings. It would really make diagnosis of TB much, much faster and easier. There are fast followers of the expert, and one of them is being made by an Indian biotech company, and we're currently validating it. It's a point of care test. It can be battery operated, so it can actually be taken down to a very peripheral level, and it's based on a chip technology. And if found to be as sensitive and specific, then one of these could well be a cheaper alternative to the gene expert. The other tests that have been used in HIV-infected people is the urine lipoarabinomannan, which is available both as an ELISA as well as a dipstick in people who are not able to produce sputum. The urine lamp, when used in combination with either the gene expert in urine or an AFB smear done on sputum, had a fairly good sensitivity, but only in people with low CD4 count. So this is one test that works better in people who are severely immunosuppressed, particularly in the hospitalized population. Moving on to TB in HIV-infected children, this is even more difficult to diagnose because it's very difficult to get a specimen. And from the Treat Asia cohort, there was recently a paper published that showed that about 17% of children in that cohort had developed TB over a 13-year period, and 5% had died. And they also that the median CD4 at the time of TB was fairly low. The good thing was that 82% had a favorable outcome on treatment. And recently, a study that we're doing in multiple ART clinics in India showed the incidence of TB amongst HIV-positive children was about 2 per 100 person years, even though they were on antiretroviral treatment. It's being presented as a poster tomorrow afternoon. So TB is quite common in HIV-infected children in our area. And what's really needed is more training in specimen collection and in using a diagnostic algorithm and in a standardized form of chest X-ray reading in order to make a more evidence-based diagnosis of TB in children. There are also very few papers published on iris in children. We know it's common, and it's mostly the unmasking type of iris because active TB is often missed at the time that ART has been initiated. This review is interesting. I want to mention it because it looked at diagnosis of etiological diagnosis of acute pneumonia in two groups, severely malnourished children and HIV-infected children. And they found that, of course, these studies were all done in southern Africa, but 10% of children with acute pneumonia, who were thought to have acute pneumonia, actually had tuberculosis. And in young children, the extrapulmonary manifestations are more common. So we need to look for TB even in situations where it might look like it's actually something else. Now, MDR-TB rates, these are the rates again from our region. This is the Western Pacific. Most countries have fairly low rates of MDR-TB among new cases, and of course a little higher rates among previously treated cases. These are from India. Many from the Southeast Asia region, and again, we see that most of the countries have rates between 2 to 3% among new cases and 15 to 20% among old cases. One thing to be careful, we've just done an analysis. In India, we still use a thrice weekly regimen for TB treatment for all TB patients. And when we looked at a group of patients with and without HIV infection and looked at the risk factors for the emergence of rifampicin resistance, we found that overall the resistance, baseline resistance to isoniazid was the strongest risk factor. And being HIV positive was also a risk factor. When we looked just at the HIV infected cohort, again, the baseline resistance to INH comes out as most important factor, and baseline CD4 being low and a high mycobacterial load are other important risk factors. So as far as treatment is concerned, it's best to treat patients with an appropriate anti-TB regimen right from the beginning. As far as possible, patients with HIV and suspected TB should have drug resistance testing available to them at baseline, preferably by a molecular method like ExPERT or the line probe assay. We need to ensure adherence to treatment and determine outcomes. And new drugs for TB like delaminid and bedaquiline, these two drugs have been approved in the last 2 years, but the experience in HIV-infected people is fairly limited, but they do not have drug interactions with rifampicin, so that's one good thing. And on the other side, we see the kind of burden of the pill burden that even a child with MDR-TB has to take. And there are very long and painful regimens for 20 to 24 months, and the favorable outcomes are seen only in about 50 to 60% of MDR, and even fewer, 25% or so, long-term favorable outcomes with XDR-TB. That's the global TB drug pipeline, showing that there are now new drugs in these two have been approved, the delamanid and bedaquiline, but will still go through phase 3 clinical trials. And finally, I just take one more minute on prevention of TB. We know that immune status is key, and therefore the best way to prevent TB really is earlier HIV diagnosis and treatment. Preventive therapy now has been shown to work not just in people with evidence of latent TB infection, but even those who are TST or IGRA negative at baseline. There's very limited experience in this part of the world with IPT, but if we want to have a handle on TB and eliminate it, then we need to pay attention to this large pool of latently infected people as well as treating those with active treatment. So we can use for HIV-infected people the 4-symptom screen and use a regimen like isoniazid for 6, 12, or 36 months, regardless of TST status or ART status. And a few countries in this region are now scaling up preventive therapy. Of course, there are newer regimens like the 12-week weekly once rifapentine isoniazid regimen and a 1-month regimen with rifapentine and isoniazid. If found to be effective, these would certainly improve compliance. And finally, there's now more and more work being done to try to integrate TB, ART, maternal child health, opioid substitution, all these therapies to make it easier for patients and to get better adherence and long-term outcomes. And there are newer models like community or home provision of ART and couriering of ART drugs that's being tried in South Africa, that really we need to do more and more of integration and decentralization as the number of people on these medications is going to increase. There are a number of issues, but the one research issue I think is important is how to reduce mortality. In this co-infected population, we still have death rates of 15% as opposed to less than 5% in HIV uninfected TB patients. And therefore, we need to see strategies. And nutrition would play a very important role, I think, in trying to reduce mortality in this group. We need shorter, safer, and more convenient regimens, and also more research on pharmacokinetics of second-line and newer anti-TB drugs in this population. And finally, I'd like to thank my colleagues, as well as colleagues at the Department of AIDS Control and the Central TB Division, Dr. Diane Havler and Heliusis, for their input. Thank you very much.